The night Owen found the draft, he understood for the first time that the most honest things people say are the things they never actually send. Owen Mercer was 39 years old, a Finnish carpenter who worked mostly on old houses that needed their bones respected. He refinished hardwood floors, restored crown molding, fixed the things that years had bent out of their original shape. He was good at reading a room the way a doctor reads a patient, quietly, without announcing what he noticed. He had been divorced for 2 years from a woman named Stephanie, who had wanted a man who planned further ahead than next Thursday, and while Owen didn't hold that against her, he had come to understand that he was the kind of person who operated best in the present tense. He wasn't miserable. He wasn't even particularly sad. He was just quiet in the way that apartments get quiet when one person is living the life that used to have 2 people in it. The roommate arrangement had been practical from the start. Owen owned the duplex, a narrow 2-story on a street of old oaks in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of street where the sidewalks had been cracked by roots for 30 years and nobody ever fixed them. He lived upstairs. The downstairs unit had sat empty for 8 months after his last tenant moved to Phoenix, and his accountant had pointed out, with the enthusiasm of a man describing a broken furnace, that the mortgage did not care about Owen's preference for solitude. So he had listed it. Clara Voss had answered the listing with a voice message instead of a text, which he had found strange, and had then shown up to the showing 10 minutes early carrying a travel mug that said, "Not before coffee," in a font that appeared to be arguing with itself. She was 36. She had recently ended an engagement to a man named Daniel, which she mentioned without visible distress the way you mentioned that a flight got cancelled. She taught botanical illustration at a community college on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons and spent the rest of her time doing freelance scientific illustration for journals and textbooks. Owen had not known that botanical illustration was a job until that conversation. He had said so, and she had looked at him with an expression that landed somewhere between amusement and patience and said, "It's been a job since 1680. You're just not reading the right journals." He handed her the lease that afternoon. For 4 months they were neighbors the way people in adjacent apartments are neighbors, politely, at a distance, with occasional interaction that never crossed into territory that required emotional preparation. She borrowed his ladder twice. He knocked on her door once in November when the boiler made a sound that suggested it was reconsidering its life choices, and she opened it still holding a paintbrush, her hair clipped up with something that appeared to be a pencil, wearing a sweater that had a smear of green along the left cuff. He fixed the boiler. She made coffee. They stood in her kitchen for about 20 minutes talking about nothing that mattered, and then Owen went back upstairs and sat at his own kitchen table for a long moment before remembering what he had come downstairs to do in the first place. It was January when things shifted, though not dramatically, because nothing in Owen's life shifted dramatically. He was not a man things happened to suddenly. He was a man things happened to slowly, and then all at once, the way wood cracks, not when you strike it, but after the cold has worked its way in over a season, and the grain decides, quietly and all at once, that it has held the shape of the old thing long enough. Clara had started working late at her kitchen table, and since the floors in the duplex were old and sound permeable in the way that old floors are, Owen could sometimes hear the faint scrape of her stool, the particular silence that meant she was concentrating, the occasional soft exhale that meant something had not gone the way she intended. He told himself he wasn't listening. This was technically true, in the same way it is technically true that you are not watching the sky when you notice a storm coming. The Saturday it happened was unremarkable in every way that preceded it. Owen had spent the morning refinishing a set of window casings for a job in Bexley, had come home with sawdust in his collar, and was standing in his kitchen eating a sandwich and looking out at the backyard, which in January was just frozen dirt and a fire pit nobody had used since October. His phone was charging. He realized he had left his drill downstairs in the shared utility room the previous week, and since Clara's unit shared the utility space through an internal door, he knocked on her door before going through. She wasn't home. She had mentioned going to the farmer's market that morning and something about a grocery run. The door to her kitchen was unlocked, which she had told him was fine whenever he needed the utility room. He went through, got the drill, and was heading back when he passed her kitchen table. Her phone was there, screen still lit, tilted against a stack of illustration books. The notification light was blinking. He wasn't looking at it. He was reaching past it for his jacket, which he had apparently left draped over the back of her chair during the boiler incident weeks ago and had entirely forgotten about. His sleeve caught the edge of a sketchbook. The sketchbook knocked the phone. The phone slid half an inch on the table's surface, and the screen, which had been dimmed but not locked, lit up fully with the impact. Owen saw it for exactly the length of time it takes to register something you weren't meant to see. The app was the Notes application. The document was titled, in the small text at the top of the draft, "Don't send this." And the first line of the draft, visible in the preview before the screen dimmed again, read, "Owen is the first person I've wanted to be honest with in a long time, and I don't know what to do with that." He picked up his jacket. He picked up the drill. He went back upstairs and stood in his own kitchen for 4.5 minutes without moving. He did not say anything that evening. Clara came back at noon, knocked upstairs to let him know the heat on her side was running a little hot, and did he want to check the thermostat from the main panel later, and he said sure, and she said she'd made too much soup if he wanted any, and he said maybe later, and that was all. He sounded entirely normal. This was the longest performance of his adult life. The soup thing was a pattern between them, he realized. Clara frequently made too much of things, soup, pasta, a pan of roasted vegetables, and offered the surplus in a tone that suggested it was purely logistical, a matter of not wasting food, and not in any way an invitation. Owen had been accepting these offers without examining them too closely for about 6 weeks, which he now recognized as a personal failure of observation in a man who made his living noticing things. He went down for the soup at 7. Her kitchen was the same kitchen it always was, warm amber light from the fixture over the counter, a small lamp on the table with a cord that was slightly too long, a smell that was equal parts whatever she had cooked, and the faint mineral smell of her watercolors, which she kept on a rolling cart near the window. The soup was white bean and kale, and she had clearly added something that involved rosemary, because the whole room smelled like a hillside that had made good decisions. They ate at her kitchen table the way they had started doing on irregular Saturdays, which neither of them had formally arranged, and neither of them had commented on. The conversation moved the way it usually did, across subjects without apparent agenda, occasionally doubling back, occasionally stopping on something that felt worth sitting with. She was talking about a commission she'd taken for a university press, something involving invasive plant species in the Midwest, and how she had spent an afternoon photographing thistle along a drainage ditch, and had found it genuinely beautiful in a way that the botanists writing the book probably hadn't intended. Owen said, "You find the value in things people dismiss. It's a skill." She looked at him for a moment in the way she sometimes did, like she was calibrating something. "Is that what it looks like from the outside?" "That's what it is," he said. "The thistle, the boiler, the pencil situation with your hair." She touched her hair, which currently had an actual pencil in it, and looked somewhere between caught and pleased. "The pencil is functional." "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." The rain that had been threatening all evening finally arrived, tapping against her kitchen window with the irregular rhythm of rain that has decided to take its time. She set her mug down and looked at the window, and then back at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "After 4 months of soup, I feel like I should be nervous." "You probably should." She paused. "Are you always this careful?" Owen looked at the mug in his hands. "Depends what I'm trying not to break." She didn't answer right away. When she looked back, something in her face had changed in the subtle way that faces change when a person decides to stop performing a position they've been holding. "Well," she said quietly, "for the record, I'm not made of glass." That would have been enough for Owen to carry for a week, and he would have carried it carefully, in the responsible way he did everything. But things have a way of not waiting for careful men to catch up. The following Friday, Clara's ex-fiancé Daniel showed up at the duplex. Owen knew this because he was in the driveway unloading lumber when a silver car pulled up, and a man in a coat that fit too well for the neighborhood got out and looked at the house with the expression of a person who believes that showing up constitutes a plan. He was roughly Owen's age, smoother than Owen in the way that men who have never refinished a floor tend to be smoother than men who have, and he walked toward the front of the building without acknowledging Owen's existence, which told Owen most of what he needed to know in about 8 seconds. Owen kept unloading lumber. He heard the knock at Clara's door. He heard Clara's voice, which changed register in a way that made the back of his neck tighten. He heard Daniel's voice, which had the calibrated reasonableness of a man who had practiced his position. He couldn't hear the words. The walls were better on the front side, but he could hear the shape of the conversation, and the shape was not good. It went on for 11 minutes, and then he heard Clara's door close, and then it was quiet. He finished unloading the lumber. He did not knock on her door. He stacked the boards by the garage and went upstairs and made coffee and waited. She knocked at 8:30. He opened the door and she was standing in the hallway in a sweater he had not seen before, holding her own elbows in a way that had nothing to do with being cold. "He wants to try again," she said. "I know," Owen said. "I heard the shape of it." She looked at him. The shape of it. Reasonable tone? Long? You didn't sound convinced? I wasn't. She looked past him into his kitchen for a moment, then back at him. He said I was being impulsive, moving here, the new setup, all of it. He said I was running away from a good situation because I was afraid of commitment. Owen picked up his coffee mug, set it down. What did you say? I said the situation wasn't good. It was comfortable. There's a difference. She paused. He said that I had been romanticizing. She made a small gesture with one hand that was not quite a gesture toward Owen, but was not quite away from him either. A situation that isn't realistic. Owen was quiet for a moment. Rain was back at the window, or maybe it had never really left. Daniel, he said, seems like the kind of man who thinks everyone is for sale just because he is. Something shifted in her expression. Small, precise, like a key finding a lock it was made for. That's the most accurate thing anyone has said about him in 3 years, she said. He'll come back, Owen said. People like that don't take the first no. I know. She looked at him steadily. I'm not worried about the second no. He thought about the draft for 3 days, not obsessively. Owen was not built for obsession, but with the consistent low-frequency attention he gave to problems that deserved solving correctly. He had not told her what he saw. He was not sure if telling her was the right thing or the honest thing, and in his experience those were sometimes different things. On Tuesday evening, she knocked with leftover roasted vegetables and a bottle of wine she had apparently been given by a grateful student, and they sat at his kitchen table for once, which felt different in the way a room feels different when you've rearranged the furniture. Same room, different weight. She talked about the Thistle Project. He talked about a house in Clintonville where the original chestnut trim had been painted over 6 times, and he was slowly working backward through the decades of it like an archaeologist with a heat gun. You love that part, she said. The undoing. The revealing, he said. It's already there. I'm just removing what was put on top of it. She looked at her wine for a moment. I wrote something, she said, a few months ago. I didn't send it. I think you might have seen it. The kitchen was very quiet except for the radiator and the rain. I wasn't reading it, he said. The phone screen lit up. I saw one line. I figured. She looked at him. Did it change anything? It changed how carefully I was paying attention, he said, which was probably the problem before. She set her glass down. The lamp on his counter threw warm light across the table, and the rain was steady now against the kitchen window, the kind of rain that turns an evening domestic, that makes the inside of a room feel like a decision. Owen, she said quietly, I'd love that, if you were paying attention. He looked at her. I've been paying attention since the boiler, he said. She laughed once softly, and then the laugh settled into something quieter, and she looked at him the way she had looked at him once from across her kitchen table when she said she wasn't made of glass. And he understood that they had arrived somewhere that had been waiting for them for a long time. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held it. The rain did the rest. The morning Daniel came back, and Owen had been right. He did come back 10 days later, with a more reasonable tone and a larger gesture, which in this case was a dinner reservation he had texted Clara about without asking if she wanted it. Clara knocked on Owen's door before 9 in the morning, which was unusual. She was calm. She told Owen about the text. Owen said nothing for a moment. Do you need me to be there? He asked. I need you to not be there, she said, and to trust that I don't need you to be there. He looked at her. Yeah, he said. I know. She texted Daniel back from Owen's kitchen table with Owen across from her with his coffee, saying nothing. She typed for about 40 seconds and then set the phone face down on the table. She looked up. Done, she said. Owen raised his mug. She raised hers. It was the quietest ending to a complicated thing he had ever witnessed. What came after was ordinary in all the ways that matter most. Clara kept the downstairs unit. She eventually moved most of herself upstairs without either of them deciding that this was what was happening. It was more that the coffee was always on one floor, and the good lamp was on another, and her rolling cart of watercolors began appearing in his front room without ceremony, and the pencils migrated. The fire pit in the backyard got used again in March when Owen got it cleaned out, and they sat out there on a Thursday evening with beer bottles sweating on the metal table and the oak trees beginning to think about spring. And she told him a thing about thistle she had never told the botanists in her commission, and he told her a thing about chestnut wood that he had never told a client because they wouldn't have cared the way she would. In May, he took her to a house in Worthington he was starting, a 1,920 seconds colonial with original Douglas fir floors and 6 layers of paint on the woodwork, the kind of house that required patience the way some people require patience, with patience. He showed her the crown molding in the dining room, where someone in 1953 had painted over a hand-carved vine detail that ran the full perimeter of the room. He watched her face when he showed her a section he had already cleared. "It's been there the whole time," she said. "It's been there the whole time," he said. She turned to look at him, and the morning light came through the original wavy glass of the windows and moved across the cleared wood in a way that was, he thought, worth every careful year that had led to standing in that room. He proposed in his kitchen, which was their kitchen by then, in October, with no dinner reservation involved. There was a soup on the stove, too much of it in the old habit, and her watercolors on the table, and the rain they had come to think of as theirs against the window, and a brass key that he had made for her in January on a night he had told himself was practical. He set it on the table in front of her and said simply that he would very much like it if the key kept being relevant. She looked at the key for a long moment. Then she looked at him. "Owen," she said, "I wrote that draft in December, the night after the boiler." She paused. "It took you long enough to find it." He smiled, the rare, quiet kind that was more feeling than performance. "I was being careful." "I know," she said. She picked up the key. "I'd love that."